these are my disclosures, not really apropos to this talk. So this is Professor K.T. Dolakia, obviously a great man in Indian orthopedics, and for the young surgeons here, a well-known surgeon all over the world. He had a hand in many of the major medical and academic institutions in Mumbai, and for his citizenship, he won one of the highest awards in Indian society. You could see some pretty famous people that he's meeting with there. Now, he and I have a couple things in common. One, he's tall. Two, he's good looking. And three, he does the posterior approach. So I like him, even though I didn't know him. Many of the orthopedic surgeons at those times started in pediatrics. That's really how orthopedics started, right? Crippled children. So he made a big contribution in care of crippled children, but as many surgeons did, as their career went on, got interested in arthroplasty, and you can see up there the 43-year post-op x-ray of a Charnley hip. And that basically tells the story. The femoral head is eccentric in the socket, there's polyethylene wear, and the socket is loose, but those patients did relatively well for a long period of time. Now, as I said, he was a well-known surgeon internationally. He was elected, I think he was the first Indian surgeon to be elected to the Scoliosis Research Society. It's very hard, even today, to get elected to that society. He was president of CCOT from 1978 to 1981, and he handed over the presidency to Maurice Mueller, who, for the senior surgeons in the room, certainly know Professor Mueller, one of the pioneers in hip arthroplasty from Europe. He hung out with the cool guys in orthopedic surgery for the time. So you'll see these pictures up there. Bob Salter was chair at the University of Toronto, pediatric orthopedic surgeon, the Salter osteotomy. Mike Robluski was a junior partner, Sir John Charnley at Wrightington, and Mike was a mentor of mine. You see Professor Mueller, and again, you see the tall, good-looking guy with all the shorter orthopedic surgeons. Chit Ranawat, one of the most famous orthopedic arthroplasty surgeons of my time, unfortunately passed away last fall. Denise Patel, one of the fathers of arthroscopy. So very famous friends and was well respected across the world. The prior orators, I'm happy to be part of this group. They're also my friends. Alan Gross, who's sitting here somewhere in the room and has joined us for this meeting. Brian Parsley, who was president of ISHKS. Chit Ranawat, who you all know, and Dan Barry, who is one of my very closest friends. So I thought it was appropriate in this time to talk a little bit about the history of hip replacement, where we were and where we are today. First total hip replacement by this gentleman here, Themistocles Gluck. He did it with ivory and patients had polio. His boss changed, his new boss came in and said, "You're out of your mind," and fired him. And that sat on the sidelines for many years. Sir John Charnley was a bit of a difficult man, as was suggested in the introduction, and he was very careful about introducing this technology for the reasons that Dr. Dolakia had told us, that you got to be careful how it's introduced. He introduced the concept of the low frictional torque arthroplasty. He didn't have that right, actually. Frictional torque does not lead to loosening. It's polyethylene wear. He did have the right idea about low friction, however. So he wanted a low friction material pair. Unfortunately, he chose stainless steel against Teflon as his first choice. Did a couple hundred cases, they all failed. Now imagine in today's world, you do a couple hundred cases and basically they all fail. You probably would give up, right? Well, he didn't give up. He went back and he introduced ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, and that actually did well for many years, but that still was the weak link, as we'll talk about. He had several contributions that extend beyond his hip replacement. He emphasized the importance of surgical training. As was previously noted, he wouldn't let anybody do the operation unless he trained with them, and it was hard to get permission to train with them. He insisted on clinical follow-up. You don't know how your patients are doing unless you're following up, and he had a system for clinical follow-up, and probably one of the first in the world to do this on a wide-scale basis. And from my standpoint, my interest has always been in the biologic response to implant material, and he did autopsy studies back when no one was doing them and saw a lot of things that predicted is the word I'm looking for, the future. Now, if you look at the results of Charnley hip replacement, they were pretty good, right? This is out of John Callahan and Dick Johnson's study. There's studies out of the Mayo Clinic and studies from here that show you long-term follow-up, not too bad, right? 92% femoral survivorship, 85% acetabulary component for survivorship. Now, the weak link was definitely the polyethylene and the bearing surface. Despite the fact they had a 22 millimeter head with a low sliding distance, they still wore and they came loose. If you look at the successful hips and look at the ones that revised for loosening, you can see that the wear rate in the loosened hips was over 50% higher than the ones that survived. So that was a tip that polyethylene wear was the issue. Now this became an issue in the United States, and there was a lot of marketing around it, and the term cement disease was introduced by David Hungerford and others, and you can see the type of osteolysis that occurs around these cemented sockets. You get a radiolucency at the cement bone interface. The implant migrates into that radiolucency, but it's destroying bone as it's doing it. That led to the introduction of cementless technology. So people said, party's over. We've got biologic fixation. The problem was the bone cement. We have no bone cement, and so we're going to solve the problem. Well, unfortunately, that was not the case, and it really helped my career, quite honestly. I was a fellow in Boston with Dr. Harris in 1989, and one of my jobs was to follow all the cementless hip replacements. And I came across these cases where we started to see osteolysis around the tip of these stems. We had no idea what was going on. We didn't even know what to call it. In the paper I wrote for JBGS, we called it end osteoerosion and not osteolysis. And unfortunately, the femoral side was actually the better side. As the senior surgeons all know here, the real problem was the socket, where you've got these massive osteolytic defects that were response to polyethylene wear debris, and a lot of these sockets weren't loose. So these patients were completely asymptomatic. By the time they came in to see us as surgeons, they had massive defects. Fortunately, that's for the most part gone. Now, when I look at these sockets, there is a difference between the fixation surface and success. On-growth surfaces are no bueno. They did not work well. In-growth surfaces almost uniformly work pretty well. The problem with the on-growth surfaces was getting a good mechanical interlock between the implant and bone. This was an HA-coated implant. You can see it's micro-textured. You can see the high failure rate here. These are the retrievals that we had. You can see the HA is resorbing, really no connection to the bone once the HA resorbed, and these basically fell out. If you look at the autopsy studies, again going back to some of Charlie's work, you can see that there's really no mechanical connection. So once you get osteolysis that disrupts the support, bony support, the things are basically loose. The same thing for plasma spray, right? So you see these lesions, you see plasma spray, it's strong in compression, it's pretty strong in shear, but in tension, it's not strong. So when you got a osteolytic defect around the superior part of the socket, over time, the socket would flip out. So you can see early on in your upper left, you see the osteolysis developing, and you see what happens as you get the defect, you lose support superiorly, weaken tension, and the socket flips out. Contrast that to cobalt chrome beads, titanium fiber mesh, or all the modern surfaces. These are scanning electron micrographs we did on autopsy specimens, and you can see the degree of mechanical interlock where the bone goes right down to the beads, right down through the titanium fiber mesh to the substrate. And in these cases, patients could get massive osteolysis, but the stems were still the sockets were still well fixed. And we grafted these. We wrote about that in several articles. Cementless stems a little different. It didn't really matter what you covered them with. Plasma spray, three-dimensional ingrowth surface, as long as it was circumferential. We learned from the experience of the Harris-Kalani stem, which was patch porous coated, that you got good ingrowth into the titanium fiber mesh, but around the smooth portion of the stem, you had a periprosthetic cavity, and you can see on your lower right, that membrane is full of polyethylene debris under polarized light microscopy. So the debris would just go down the smooth portions, pool around the end of the stem, and you get osteolysis around the end of the stem, as you see here. Stem well fixed, you can see taking it out was no party, but you saw that the distal osteolysis. Contrast that with any circumferential porous coating. You can see again on the autopsy specimen. On your right, cross-section through the stem, the bone is going right into these pores. Fluid and debris cannot get down there, and in fact, these did quite well. Their osteolysis was proximal. Now, the problem with the proximal osteolysis that over time, with significant osteolytic defects, you could get fractures, pathologic fractures of the lesser trochanter or the greater trochanter. Now, full circuit. The problem was wear in the 60s, and it was wear in the 90s. This is a 45-year-old woman, happened to be an attorney, who had this osteolytic defect, was seen on routine follow-up. And if you look at the light microscopy, it was classic foreign body reaction. The same thing we saw around cemented total hip replacement. And when you look at the sockets, the junior residents would always say, well, the warm part's on your left. No, it's the right. It's the wear polished area that is generating the polyethylene debris. The upper right is a scanning electron micrograph of the surface. And you see all those little polyethylene shards, they're less than a micron in size, and as the hip goes back and forth through the gait cycle, and as crossing wear passes, those are sheared off, and in the lower right is all polyethylene that's taken from that one specimen at revision surgery. So you're really talking about billions of particles of polyethylene. This started the plethora of research studies looking at different bearing surfaces. In the late 1990s, the USA approved highly crossing polyethylene. They approved metal on metal, and they reapproved ceramic on ceramic, which had been taken off the market in the 1980s. And by the early 2009, 2010, you can see that about 35% of hips were done with metal on metal. Obviously a big problem for us as revision surgeons in the US. Now when you look at the highly cross-linked polyethylene, the research was done by multiple academic medical centers and multiple companies. And you can see the wear rate on the y-axis and the radiation dose on the x-axis. And as you increase the radiation dose up to about 10 megarads, you got a decrease in wear. After that, there wasn't much bang for your buck. That's why most of the products are around 9 or 10 megarads of sterilization. And the cool thing about the highly cross-linked polyethylene that was different from conventional polyethylene, it was relatively insensitive to head size, which allowed us to go from 22, 26, and 28 millimeter heads up to 32, 36, and 40 millimeter heads, which has had a huge impact on revision rate for things like dislocation. This was introduced, I think, appropriately. These are the RSA studies that were done in Sweden. And good news for us as surgeons is that no matter which company you use, they all seem to work okay. If you saw what happened early on with bedding in, and then after the first year or so, you'd see a flat line, no measurable wear. With conventional polyethylene, even really good conventional polyethylene, it continued to wear over time. Now the question you have to ask is, did the reduction in wear reduce the rate of osteolysis? We all know the answer to that now. This was the first paper published by Tom Schmalzry in 2008 comparing Marathon and Enduron, highly statistically significant reduction in osteolysis. We did a little different study in patients that we continue to follow today. These were done in the early 2000s, 1999, early 2000s. All the patients were under the age of 50. We've now got 20-year follow-up on the patients that are still alive. We do not have a single case of osteolysis clinically significant in this group of patients under the 50 at 20 to 25 years. So I would challenge you to show me a single case with highly cross-linked polyethylene that wore and led to failure because of wear. Now look at the impact in Australia, and the Australian registry has made some great contributions. You can see where it crossed over in the early 2000s, and look at the revision burden for that country. Conventional polyethylene up around 16%, highly cross-linked polyethylene around 6%. Think of the patient's morbidity, mortality, the cost savings associated with that introduction of that one product. That has been probably the biggest advance we've had in hip arthroplasty in my lifetime, and probably in anybody's lifetime. Metal on metal died a lingering death, as you know. We saw a lot of these pseudotumors. Classic example, malpositioned socket on the right. You see the large pseudotumor going up the iliopsoas tendon sheath, displacing the bladder, going up the iliac wing. And this is the patient showed up that they thought she had a DVT, then they thought she had a sarcoma, and she ended up having this type of necrosis. You can see the trochanter is bare, the abductors are gone. You can see the structure, that big fat sciatic nerve in the back. This is all the debris that was taken out of there, and this is the reconstruction. These patients did not do well, as you can well imagine. Ceramics, they were introduced in the US in the 80s, taken off the market for poor results of the Mittelmeyer, came back on the market, and they also died a lingering death. There's concerns over fracture, although with modern ceramics, it really is not an issue. And the squeaking really killed ceramics in the United States, and I don't believe it will ever come back. So ceramics aren't dead. Almost all the femoral heads now are ceramic. Why? It's not related to wear. You can see that over 80% are ceramic femoral heads. Wear is not an issue with highly cross-linked polyethylene. It doesn't matter what surface you put up against it, it really doesn't wear. Cobalt, chrome, aluminum, zirconia, the issue was taper corrosion. And you can't predict who's going to get this. And in some of these cases, it was bad as pseudotumors. You get serious adverse local tissue reaction with destruction of muscles and really some unreconstructible type of lesions with these. And we showed early on that if you look at titanium compared to cobalt, cobalt is very toxic. It kills the cells, as you can see on the scanning electron micrograph on your left. Titanium is inflammatory. It's like polyethylene. It stimulates bone-resorbing cytokines. So two different responses to the materials. So are the problems solved? Well, yeah, probably, right? Wear is not an issue. Again, I defy you to show me a case where wear was the source of failure with highly cross-linked polyethylene. Fixation, if you look at the 10-year results of hip replacement, no matter what company you look at, you get 95% free revision, and those are revised. Very few are related to fixation issues. And if you look at the AJRR and you look at the data, you can see that, again, almost every bearing couple, you're talking about a couple percentage points of failure at 8 to 10 years. So what problems remain? Stability and function. I think stability with a good trowel reduction, large femoral head, appropriate preoperative planning, offset stems, you should get stability down to 1% or less. Infection is where the money is right now, right? We have not made any impact infection in my lifetime. This is both the Swedish and Norwegian registries looking at infection as a source of failure, and you can see that, you know, when antibiotics were introduced, infection rate came down. The next 3 decades, no change in failure for infection. So for the young surgeons out there, you want to make a big contribution, work on infection. It's the main cause of hip revision, it's the main cause of knee revision, and there's opportunities for improvement in prevention, in diagnosis, and treatment. And thank you for your attention. Again, it's an honor to be here.